Okay, so hi everyone. I'm super excited to introduce Professor Baruch Fischhoff. Unfortunately, I have been told that I have a very little time, so I will limit myself for two quick notes. First, his doctoral advisor was Daniel Kahanman. Second, I tried to count the number of articles Baruch co-authored. Some were past 500, I lost track. So I switched to counting his books, only to discover he has probably written more books than I have co-authored articles, so I gave up on that too. Baruch, it's a great pleasure to see you with us. You don't really need an introduction, so I will skip this real part. We will proceed as following. As always, you will have about 45 to 50 minutes for the presentation, and then about 10 to 15 minutes for questions, and then those who have to go will be able to go, and we will proceed with informal discussion if it's fine with you for about 10 or 15 more minutes. So if it's fine, now, Baruch, the floor is yours, and thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to see you here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for having me. And what I thought I would do would be to talk about a style of work that I do in this department, where we've been fortunate enough to have Doron join us, the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon, where the work is theory informed. So try to know everything that's in psychology, theory informing in the sense of you may learn things that will advance the science, but it's not theory testing, and it's from a decision science tradition. So this is the department. The overview of the talk, I talk some general thoughts about science, basic science and applications, look at very briefly, look at 3 long-running research programs. I have links to everything, so I'll just talk about the kinds of papers rather than to go into any of the details. People can find I have references to the details, and I'll leave the slides with the organizers and then have some final reflections. So science and applications. So this is our department. The organizing assumption of this department, which has been around for about 50 years, is that hard problems need people with training in each relevant discipline, working together, contributing all that their discipline has to offer, and confident that the experience will yield insights to pursue with disciplinary science. And to our way of looking, decision science is the backbone for coordinating these different sciences. So here's a bit of a rose gallery of people from the department. Most of them have joint appointments. We have people who know cryptography, air pollution, power systems dynamic, cyber crime, and other things. So each has a disciplinary expertise, and then we work together on problems. The decision science framework, this is a bit showing you how I try to make the case to people from outside the field. This is something close to Ward Edwards' original characterization from 70-odd years ago, that when you approach a problem, first analyze it using the best available knowledge and uncertainties, do descriptive research to find out how decision makers see it now, design ways to help them, see how well you're doing, and then repeat. And in work done or ongoing in EPP, we've followed this, I guess, basic template in a wide variety of different topics, a few of which I'll talk about today. So this is my pitch to the non-psychologist, non-decision science. How can we do it? Well, we have a small core of analytical methods that can apply to a wide variety of problems. These will all be familiar to people on this on this call. We have a small suite of empirical methods, which again will be familiar to everybody on this call, but not necessarily to people outside who may think of social science as just doing surveys or just doing experiments. And that we have this vast 150 years of research into basic behavioral principles. This is a slide that I often use. Well, here are some principles of judgment. And I try to make the point that there are people who spend their career working about the details of the well, I guess what's now thought of as the automaticity frequency tracking, and then I have a slide on principles of choice. Again, these will all be principles familiar to people, and then we have applications that draw on research regarding specific topics, which again, people on this call have made major contributions to these areas. And then in making the pitch, I end with a slide something like this. So which I attribute to Herb Simon, who was, active until he passed away. That I think Herb would agree with this, which is that behavior follows simple principles. However, the set of principles is large. The contextual triggers are subtle. Their interactions are complex. And the result, broad knowledge, detailed analysis, and testing are needed. So that's why it's not enough to know this behavioral decision science on a need-to-know basis. You really need people with the kind of disciplinary training that's represented on this call. So talk about research in three areas versus climate change. So I went to my first climate meeting. Jimmy Carter was president when I went to my first climate meeting. There was a joint project by the then new Department of Energy and the AAAS to come up with a 20-year research program for research in what was called then carbon dioxide effects, CO2-induced climate change. If you read the statement from there was a social science group that I was in. This was, I think, produced with a daisy wheel printer, which will may be familiar to a few of the old timers on the call. It actually reads pretty well 45 years later, and it ended with this statement: the problem calls for unprecedented interdisciplinary research effort. So it seemed like, great, we were going to be in the beginning. We were going to help to co-create this research program. I wrote this paper 45 years ago, which I think is the first application of psychology to climate change. And then nothing happened. The Reagan administration pulled the plug on the program about a year later. There was no social science going, so no social science got started. The natural sciences hunkered down and were able to revive their programs. And when the money started flowing, they didn't share. They just trusted the science of climate change to speak its own truth to the public. There were a few projects, and at that time we did one about 15 years later that appeared in the journal Risk Analysis. A while ago, I looked to see how often are we cited, and so there were virtually no citations until about, let's say, 30 years after the DOE AAAS program. So roughly a quarter of a century went by without a lot of social science applied to climate change. And assuming that we have something to offer, we collectively are suffering from that. And when people started to get interested, they found our paper. So one of the things that gave a push to the social sciences was the Obama administration's response to the financial crisis in 2007, 2009. Some of their RFPs required having social science involved. We teamed up with PEPCO, which is the DC area utility, and had a program of research that was summarized in this paper in Nature Climate Change from 2016. And the people involved are Gabriel Wang-Perotti, who's at Stanford now, Tamar Krishnamurti, who's a former PhD student now at Pitt, Alex Davis, another former PhD student who's dropped out of academia, Daniel Schwartz, who went back to, also PhD student, gone back to Chile. And in trying to make the case for social decision science to a general science audience, this was the characterization that we offered in the paper. We have these three steps: formal on the left, formal style analysis, descriptive analysis, and then interventions. And we illustrated with three areas that had come out of either the PEPCO ARA research program or related ones. One is preparing for sea level rise. The second is adopting residential grid technology, which was the support from the from DOE. They were anticipating that people would have smart meters on their homes, devices inside their homes that would enable them to manage their utility use. And then there are many investments in energy efficiency in office buildings where the uptake has historically been very low. So we tried to work on that as well. So I'll show you very quickly the research program that emerged from that. So the first thing we did in looking at the effectiveness of energy interventions was to look at the literature. So Alex and Tamar and Wendy, who probably many of you know, but particularly Alex and Tamar led this, managed to find 32 papers at the time of field trials of electricity usage interventions. When they started reading them, we applied. So we've also done work in medicine. I'll show a little bit of that later. And one of the cornerstones of medical research is the Cochrane collaboration, which establishes standards for medical research and particularly for how to weight or whether to include studies in meta-analyses. And this was the version of their continually updated guideline that we had available at that time. And so what particularly Alex and Tamar discovered when they looked in detail at these 32 reports, that the methodological standard fell well below what would be required of a medical field trial. So using the Cochrane standards, which identified the 6 largest biases, this was their characterization of these 32 papers. So the yellow is most of them had unknown risk of bias because they just didn't report the issues, and the red is there was a high risk of bias. So the top line is almost everybody reported how they got their participants, but most of them were volunteers, and volunteers have some unknown, have well-known biases that we've well known to this audience. So one of the things that Alex found was that there are enough cases where medical clinical trials have been conducted with and without a bias, that there are estimates of what the bias, positive or negative, is on the effect size as a result of that bias. And so we made the large assumption that the biases in medical trials had the same magnitude as in electricity field trials, and then we use that adjustment. So on the left-hand column, there's 5 kinds of interventions. The next column is those that were in bold, that were reported significant effect size aggregating over the different ones. So these were all had on average about a 3% reduction in electricity use. And the next column shows that if you apply this provocative assumption, none of them had any significant effect. And then there's 2 different ways of aggregating the data. Found the same thing with peak shaving, which are programs, programs that reduce electricity use at times of high demand. And here, the adjusted effects were about a half the repeated effects, but they were large enough originally. The reason to believe that there was still something there. So Alex and Tamar pursued this and said, well, we don't really know who are these volunteers, and they did a propensity score analysis of who are the people who show up in studies and not. So you get some idea, some way of thinking about how that bias, the reports, results in studies that were already reported. Along with Gabrielle, Jack was a research assistant, and Casey was another graduate student. They developed a protocol for how to do better, better displays. And these are journals that they're prominent journals in the energy field, and most of these studies have been pretty widely cited. So, and then some of you may have seen this paper. This was part of Daniel's PhD dissertation, where he did, I think, one of the cleanest Hawthorne effect studies that have been done. He sent people postcards, Pepco customers, one postcard a week for a month, telling them that they were in a study, and found that on average about a 2.7% reduction in energy usage over that short period of time. So this would be an example of payback to basic research from doing the applications. And then concurrently, we had an engagement with Climate Central, which is perhaps the best place in the U.S. for reporting, for translating scientific data into fairly sophisticated displays for sea level rise. Ben Schwartz, who's not Ben Strauss, rather, who's currently the head, went to grad school in ecology and evolutionary biology with our son Ilya, and he said, "Ask Ilya, can I talk to your dad about it? We've got this problem." And the problem was they were about to launch. This was about 15 years ago, and this was going to be their welcoming screen. And Ben had the sense that, well, this was really cluttered, not very welcoming. Everybody on their technical team wanted a piece of the action on it, and Ben's intuition was that people's eyes will glaze over and not know where to begin using the option. So Gabrielle and Ben did a study, excuse me, evaluating coming up with a simpler landing page where you could immediately grasp the structure of the information, and go from there to things that have particular interests. That came out in the paper in PNAS. And then once we had that display, it's a very authoritative representation of what the anticipated effects of sea level rise would be. Gabrielle and I did a couple of studies combining that with the equally precise information from Zillow, seeing how sea level rise information would if people understood it, how it would affect their hypothetical home purchases, and with some interesting results, we thought, on the effects of evoking political identity in different ways. And I wrote a summary paper of my somewhat dispirited, dispirited, but with an optimistic ending paper on summarizing my experience in this area, and how I think we collectively missed an opportunity to be in a less miserable shape than we might have had more social science been engaged. So here's a completely different topic. I guess also about 15 years ago, a trauma surgeon showed up in my office with Donnie's Thinking Fast and Slow under her arm. She says, "We've been trying to figure out this problem. Why do ER physicians in primary care facilities often fail to transfer patients in time to benefit from treatment at a tertiary care facility?" So in the US, roughly half the patients who present at a local hospital with injury severity scores that should lead them to be transferred to a major medical center, only half of them are transferred. And as Deepika Mohan, the trauma surgeon, said, they also perform tests whose results will come too late to provide any value. And her archetype was an older person has fallen. Intracranial bleeding could be either cause or effect of that fall. They will, crank up get them into a CAT scan, and then by the time they know if they get a positive result, they've already missed some or even all of the golden 2 or 3 hours needed to take full advantage of transfer to a major medical facility. She said, "I read Kahneman's book. I think they're making bad judgments by representativeness. Those people, what happened to those people doesn't seem like it could produce a fatal injury." So we began on a series of projects. Each of them takes about a year. The emergency department physicians have a meeting in Las Vegas the third week of October, and Deepika has some big project for them every time. So this was the first study. There was another mathematical clinical psychologist, Corinne Ferris, was had played a big role in this one, and the study involved giving emergency department physicians, not in major medical centers, very elaborate displays like this, drawn anonymized from actual medical records, asking them what they would do. Their responses were then characterized in signal detection theory terms, and I won't go into the details of this display. And there seemed to be either people who knew what to do but were too cautious, or people who weren't too cautious and weren't cautious enough. Well, it depends what cautious means. But anyways, it wasn't working. So something intuitively was wrong about how these people were generally skilled. In trying to publish this, the first paper was published in a secondary journal. It turns out that physicians with life and death are justifiably cautious about accepting new evidence. He said, well, these are vignettes. Can you do they have any relationship to real behavior? Which was that electronic medical records, particularly through the UPMC system or the Medicare Medicaid system. If you can gain access, you can tell a lot and you have the analytical skills. So we published a paper in Medical Decision Making about arguing that you could, it's a partly predictive, partly a construct validity perspective, that there was some validity to this. Then Deepika said, well, these people they're really good at their jobs. They're really hardworking. They face a lot of medically difficult situations. They don't face a lot of diagnostically difficult decisions. And the American College of Surgeons, which has routine continuing medical education, keeps telling them the same things, and it isn't working. And her intuition was that, well, that's because it's not becoming part of their intuitive heuristic response to new situations. So how do we give people how do we build? We don't want to destroy their existing heuristics or their confidence in them, but how do we get them to stop and think that things may be more difficult? So she's developed a series. I think she's now on her fourth serious games. The first one appeared in the British Medical Journal, where they really liked the study, but they were very reluctant to publish a games something with a game in it. So they delayed publication to their Christmas issue, which has a lot of kind of lighter things, but also some real medicine. And which was great for us. It delayed publication, but everybody gets it. It's available online. People have time to read it. And I'd say, other than Corinne and I, the rest of our practicing critical care medicine people. So this was the first game. It was a realistic, very elaborately designed cases presented in a way that's somewhat like what you would experience in the ED, with the option to request lots of information. And you had a certain number of beds. It simulated in an hour. It simulated an 8-hour shift, and we manipulated cognitive load, which by either having 4 or 8 beds, with the prediction that if you increase cognitive load, people would have more heuristic judgment and would make more mistakes with the unrepresentative trauma cases. So that's and from the perspective, she said, this is probably what sold it. It had interruptions that seemed very realistic to to people who in this line of work. So we had so I had a paper in PNAS reporting on no, the BMJ paper reported on that game. Then we had a paper in PNAS that reported on this game where somebody convinced Deepika that people really like adventure games. So she created an adventure game scenario at which I don't like adventure games, and it turned out about half of the physicians loved them and half of them hated them. And it had this kind of a dramatization done with the educational technology here. And it also had positive results, but if you put it in a game rather than in a bunch of fast-paced displays, then you have a much smaller sample. So the real test of this is, you get positive results. The test retest 6 and 12 months later, seem to see some retention from the intervention conditions. And then Deepak and her colleagues went through, I think it was like 300,000, 125,000 medical records to see whether you could see a relationship between individuals' physicians' performance on these games and their real world triage and over and proper triage rates. Recruiting physicians is not easy, so Deepika actually produced a study on the different things that she tried. Her first effort, which turned out to be what she did, which turned out to be a roaring success. She gave physicians who would join her studies a mini pad and gave it away and recruited them in the exhibit section of this emergency department conference in Las Vegas, and it was so popular that the fire department shut her down. So the physicians just swarming her exhibit. So. And then finally, the payback to basic research in psychology. One of her fellows, Shreyas Kulkarni, led a study that looked at existing medical records in terms of where there were places where you found 6 conditions that were common enough on the left, 6, I guess, symptoms that were common enough that you could have a statistically reliable record. Did like an expert elicitation to see what would be symptoms that were representative of that condition being severe, and were then able to, for 9 different hospitals, to code the appropriate triage rate for for patients who had a condition and a representative symptom, and found in the records that by and large that you're more likely to be properly triaged if you had a representative condition than if you didn't. So, and then finally, probably people are a little sick of this topic, but I thought there were some illustrative studies here. So anyway, I would say this is, I think of the heuristics represented in this has been perhaps the hardest to operationalize. And I thought this was a nice example that
Actually,
the
Baruch, can I
Yeah.
ask you a question? It might be related to the study that
Why don't I finish and
Okay,
then
okay.
I've got to pace for 45
Sure,
minutes, and then
sure.
I'd be happy, and I have nothing for the next few hours. I'm happy to talk. So, some of you may remember that in the run-up to the Iraq War, the Bush administration made a big deal about weaponized smallpox. People who would be on the front line, many of them got the smallpox vaccine, and some of them died. It was an old vaccine. It was a very large dose, and people died from smallpox even when it had benefits. So some people in the military died. I was asked to invite to a meeting on what do we do about this. I met Larry Brilliant, is a larger than life character who in doing personal geography discovered we had spent 2 years together in German class at Detroit Mumford High School, and a few years earlier, and neither of us remembered the other. And our explanation was that he was 2 years ahead of me, and why would he look at me, and why would he look down at me? Why would I dare look up at him? So a couple of years. So once they had authorization for the war, smallpox kind of disappeared. There's a much milder, better formulated smallpox vaccine now. It's the one that's being used to treat mpox that fortunately had been approved around 2021. So Larry, who's an epidemiologist, and among other things, one of the people who eradicated smallpox when H5N1 avian flu came around the first time in 2005, anticipated that we would not be ready, and convened a meeting with 24 or so top medical people and 24 or so top technology people of the sort who might get us through the pandemic. You have to think of what the technology was 20 years ago. There are two converging ways of organizing the discussion. One was a scenario planning exercise that Peter Schwartz from Global Business Networks organized. It when COVID broke, the scenario was still online. It was pulled down shortly, so I was able to find a picture of it. So it was for a pathogen that was much more fatal than the one that we just had. So and the other one is that we did it together with Larry, was a structured influence diagram representation of what were the topics for both pharmacological and behavioral interventions, with the latter being informed by behavioral research, and a secondary influence diagram on compliance. And as in the run-up to the meeting, we conducted a study, this led by Wendy, that where we asked people to estimate the critical parameters. So we asked questions like this, like what is the probability that H5N1 will become an efficient human-to-human transmitter capable of being propagated through at least 2 epidemiological generations of affected humans, sometimes between the next 3 years. And we created a histogram of the responses from the experts who are the public health medical experts, and the quote unquote experts who were people, this was under Chatham House rules, so we couldn't say who was there, but some well-known people that Larry was able to bring, and we were able to contrast the beliefs of these two groups as a matter of, so we think we managed to ask this complicated question in a way that it was meaningful to people, to the medical people for whom the details really matter, and the other people who were as intelligent as they come, but for whom these were unfamiliar details. And then that was our first question. The last question flipped the conditionality of the question and got estimates, got these estimates. So we were able to look at the internal consistency of their judgments of the same question phrased in different ways, as a way of a psychologist's way of seeing how seriously you should take them. So fortunately, H5N1 spared us the last time. Didn't spare a lot of the birds, but it did spare the human population. Larry, seeing how unprepared we were, established an organization that's still going on called Ending Pandemics, which has had more success outside of the U.S. than inside the U.S. He knows Jeff Skoll, who is basically the funder of the movie Contagion, which had which probably you've seen, and you could think about how much of the cumulative effect these interventions had. When the pandemic started, I ended up being on a number of National Academy committees, one of which developed a framework for equitable allocation of COVID-19 vaccine. We had, I think these names will not be familiar to much of anybody, to people there. It was a really good group led by Helene Gale, who's the president of Spelman College now, a pediatrician, and Bill Foege, who was arguably the best head of CDC and had been one of the leaders also of smallpox eradication. We met first in the middle of July 2020 and reported out on October 2nd, so before we knew whether there was a vaccine. So one of the things in the charter of the committee was to ensure that the framework is equitable for how to allocate vaccine and is seen as equitable. So we designed it to be easily understood by diverse audiences, reliably translated into operational terms, and to distinguish scientific and ethical judgment. So we ended up with, and here I played some role, with 4 fairly simple, fairly transparent criteria for which there were available data to create a vector, a risk vector for people. That led to what was more or less the allocation scheme that was practiced in the United States, where the resources come centrally, the recommendations come centrally, but the actual distribution is handled by local authorities. One of the things that having these, kind of, you might think of fairly neutral seeing criteria was that if you follow them through, that the second phase included teachers, workers in high-risk settings, but also people in homeless shelters, people in prisons, jails, and detention centers, who might, if you just thought about the people, if thinking about social and political processes, might have been neglected. There was Margaret Brandeau, who's a decision analyst at Stanford, led a subcommittee that did basically sensitivity analyses of how these recommendations would be affected by these different changes. And by their analysis, it didn't make much of a difference, which was sort of laid out for people who are going to be implementing this. What are the things to look for, and what the decision analytic arguments would be, and how to think about them. There was a vigorous discussion on the committee whether we should do something more sophisticated, like not just go have a vector, but it's the basis of a multi-attribute utility analysis. Should we do some kind of weighting? And the conclusion was it was important to keep it simple so that it would be transparent, so everyone could understand the logic, and that people could monitor the performance of the people who were implementing it. Let's see. When the home test kits became available, we had the intuition. This is Tamar, Barry DeWitt, another former PhD student, and Steve Voloshin, a physician at Dartmouth, that the instructions that came with them were incomprehensible and misleading. So we did a study that designed something better. We were able to bring in a graphic designer who helped us with it, and had this paper in JAMA IM findings that that under some conditions the FDA endorsed instructions were worse than nothing. The people who read them, and we sort of encouraged them to read them as part of the study, made poorer decisions than people who just guessed about how to interpret test results. So Larry, who had this informal pan defense organization that led the H5N1, decided that since the public sector was having problems, he created a consulting organization to work on this, would charge people with money and use that to subsidize pro bono work. And so I've been part of that along with some other interesting people. So one of our first clients, and again, these were thanks to Larry's contact, was with the movie industry. So you think this is a depiction of a set. You can lots of intense contact. They were shut down immediately. There was kind of an interesting process that might well have been followed other places. That the governors of two of the major movie making states, the third was Georgia, didn't do this, asked the industry to produce reopening plans for their approval. So it respected the local expertise of the people who are in the industry, but said, well, we have the authority to decide whether to approve your plan. The movie industry is heavily unionized, so the unions organized into 4 groups, each with its own experts. Unions consolidated they came up with common procedural guidelines like no buffets, no shared makeup brushes. But there was a real question about how often one needed to test. So each of the groups commissioned their own risk analysis to see. If you think back to, this was June, July 2020, tests were really very hard to come by. And then they came up with a consensus report that served as a basis for negotiating with the states and the studios. Here's the report. You can still find it online. Ian Lipkin and I worked with the Directors Guild of America for a little while. I was on a first name Zoom basis with Steven Soderbergh, who wrote much of the report, which is part of the reason it was a good communication, because it had a good communicator. One pivotal thing was this risk analysis done by an epidemiologist at Columbia, looking at, well, what are the expected risks with different amounts of different testing procedures, with different ambient rates and ambient prevalence and transition rates, and with 2 different measures. What's the probability of at least one case, which would be enough to shut down a shoot, and what would be the expected number of cases, which would had another set of consequences. And this seems to have sold it. I wrote some of the text associated with it, but we didn't really know whether people actually understood it or just bought it as part of the package and figured, well, if somebody has calculated the numbers and is willing to share them, maybe they're okay. So one of my PhD students, Victor Rodriguez, did his master's thesis on seeing whether people could understand these unusual displays, and found that with a fairly simple, but in Victor's hand, well done introduction, people could more or less understand them. So I got a chair from the Directors Guild of America. Larry and Ian and some other people helped make the Oscars work the following year. So I got bottom billing, but I still got billing in the Oscars. So to wrap up, so this is our organizing assumption of EPP, which is the base for this work, that hard problems need people with training in each relevant discipline, working together, contributing all that their discipline has to offer, confident that they will that the experience will yield insights to pursue with disciplinary science. And if anyone was interested, I wrote a book summarizing these experiences, which came out earlier this month. Okay, well, thank you.
Wow, you're well on time, even 2 minutes before the time.
Oh.
Thanks to not allowing Ido to start to say what he wanted to say, but I think now Ido, you have the time.
Yeah, no, that's yeah. I'm glad you stopped me, because yeah, you did a lot of things, and you are so well organized. And anyone who tried to work with policymaker know how difficult it is, and you were able to do it. I had 2 random thoughts. One of them was more like a clarification. Maybe I'll try with a clarification that I tried to do in the middle. Although it's not, yeah. So one interesting question that related to this group who study decision from experience is a relationship between the what you call representativeness heuristics and just underweighting of rare events. So because there are different concepts, and but in this for this phenomena that both of them could be important. That is, if a doctor decide not to send people to a larger hospital, this could be because of some complex representativeness, or because that in 9 of 10 cases that he send it to the hospital, they send it back for the hospital, you say, wasted our time, and only 1 in 10 is killed, and he never get feedback for that. Well, when he makes a mistake and he does the right thing, he get negative reinforcement because he sent it to the hospital, it was a waste of time. One time they save the person that he sent to the hospital, but there's all these people he didn't send to the hospital, and then we never get negative reinforcement for that. And this is much simpler models as a representative heuristic. Have you
So,
thought about this connection?
these kind of issues were much on our mind. So we started from a signal detection theory perspective, wondering whether they under triage, they don't send people that they should because they have incentives not to do it. And our sense was that that there are hospitals that want to keep the business, but it's more psychological in terms of the decision rule that physicians like challenging medical conditions, and they don't like to get chewed out because they send people, as you were suggesting, that they shouldn't have sent. So the final intervention, based on this representatives paper that I saw, tries to get people to stop and think, which other people have used as intervention, that something might be atypical, and then think about from what they found from the records is 3 things that tend to lead, the most common things that tend to lead to under triage. So one is frailty. So people who are frail, there's more going on than you can figure out, and in medicine, in emergency, they don't have access to the general medical records. They don't treat you, they treat what happens to you. Say somebody's frail, stop and think and send them, and then you can figure it out. So it's not, you've got that information, but you need to stop and use it. The second is multiple systems. So somebody's had a motorcycle accident, a broken leg, and a ruptured spleen. It's also more complicated, and it's complicated because you can't. You could do your part, but your system can't do it. And the third is large bone injuries, and as Vivek said, everybody in this country, I'm sure in Israel as well, is well enough trained that they could set a compound fracture. But the people in the local hospitals, there's probably more of a problem here than in Israel. They don't get the aftercare. They live in rural areas. They can't get back to the hospital, and 6 months later, you have they get pneumonia and die, and you never get. I mean, you never get feedback. Well, you never get feedback on most of them unless somebody gets sent back. So, I mean, I think that line of inquiry that you were saying would be a nice way to look at to a fine-grained analysis of what's going on here, and could be theoretically instructive because they do have these vast numbers of records that can be used to test hypotheses.
Yeah, thanks. I have another question, but I'll let someone else to ask as well.
Oh, go for it.
Well, so I'll ask. Okay, so I'll ask another question. For the first project that you presented, this is really impressive. But President Trump think that global warming will only increase the beaches. So this reminds us, and he's he lives there in Florida, in a part of the area that you think gonna be that your diagram suggests, if I understand it correctly, it's gonna be underwater. So obviously he was not very impressed by your statistics. So the question is that you focus, and me too, in the past, on how to make people understand. But now we realize the problem is understanding is a small part. The problem is that they don't believe, so they don't even gonna, they are sure that we all professors, we are all We are all deep state, and we are doing terrible things, and there's no reason to waste our energy to try to read what we are giving them. So the question become from understanding in the past to the problem that why, who gonna listen to professor nowadays?
So
So have you thought about that?
yeah, so I mean, it's obviously it's a complicated, path-dependent question. So actually, we have one of my former students. I have a study in PNAS that looking at the secondary analysis, which finds something that I think other people have better evidence or complementary evidence finding that there are some issues that are not polarized that the the goal ought to be to preempt the polarization. And some are polarized on religious issues, but not political, and some are political and not. And the natural tendency of my sense is that maybe there's evidence of this, that the natural tendency of experts is to wait until they're sure, or to think that the public is so stupid that they can't possibly influence them. So they leave a vacuum, and by the time they're digging themselves out of a hole, and once they're digging themselves out of a hole, then they're facing, well, as cognitive psychologists, we know how difficult that is to reshape thinking, and then misinformation and disinformation is a problem. So in some ways, having a misinformation, disinformation, polarization problem is a failure of the experts, that they haven't. And if you get ahead, both from a cognitive perspective, you offer a perspective that may be resilient against alternative, and you, as a process matter, you have reached out, you've respected people, you've trusted their ability to understand. And I would say people tend not to ask for psychologist help until they've already lost much of the battle.
Okay, that's optimistic. Yeah, no,
But
but
it's convenient to communicate badly or to fail to communicate and blame the public.
yeah. Okay, thanks. No, this is a good answer.
So basically, you're saying it's our fault that we are not communicating the information in the right way. So what is your prediction regarding with the proliferation of smart AIs that communicate the information in a convenient way? What will happen in the future?
Well, so I would say it's the AI's people's failure to ask for help from people like those on this on this call. And on the Carnegie Mellon, we've got lots of AI people. They're not interested in help. They're confident that they're on a roll. They think their truth will speak for themselves, and I think they're just like people and most other technologies. Now and then you find somebody who acts proactive. So we have a couple of projects. I don't want to talk about them, for the record, where people have reached out, and I hope that we can help them to tell their story before other people tell them for it.
Unless someone have any questions, I'm very curious to ask you about my half-joking introduction. How you managed to publish, to co-author so many articles? So what is the secret of being so productive?
Well, so part of it is having fantastic students. So most of those projects were, many of them were masters or PhD students. Second is having these long run relationships, that are often unproductive with people who are in a particular industry. And at some point, so we've done a lot of work with the Food and Drug Administration, and like nothing came of it for 30 years until finally some of our former students ended up in the decision analysis unit, and we're able to work with them to restructure the way that new pharmaceuticals are evaluated and reported. So part of it is just having these relationships where people know you And when there's an opportunity, they can bring you in. I would say a bit of a, I don't know, maybe sleight of hand is to work with doctors because they have a much lower threshold for putting people on papers than psychologists. So if you saw the strings of authors, somebody once told me that the lead on a project is usually the first author, and the person who runs the lab, the rainmaker, is the last one. And that practice was challenged when the bibliographic services realized that there are enough unique permutations and combinations of 25 people that you don't really need the authors 26 through 30 and often, or 38, and often 38 would be the boss. So anyway, so there's a bit of inflation there. I sometimes take myself off of papers because I think it wouldn't pass our threshold, and would pass theirs. But I think, and I'm in this, I'm in. So there's I would say there's no end of these practical problems that that people like like those on the call are here, and there's I would say there's not all that many. There for many years people called Paul Slovic and me if there was something in the public sector, and I spent 2 days with Paul last week. He's still going strong, looking at people's perceptions of the risks of nuclear weapons. As I say, create those ties, and I say hope to be in a place that rewards these papers that are more applications of psychology, and that are testing theories in this realistic setting and have a different kind of evidence than the theory testing that we're all trained to do, and is essential to the discipline.
On a different note, I just wanted to thank you about your hindsight bias studies, because I'm using it in my teaching all the time. And we're trying to produce it. So I'm I'm letting them some scenarios, what's going to happen this week. And almost each time I have this hindsight bias. And unfortunately, the war gave us lots of opportunities to have so many scenarios. And I get it almost each time I run it. So, and that's thanks to your study. So,
thanks. That journal that appeared in the first issue of the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Human Perception and Performance, and they asked me to write. They're celebrating their 50th year, and they asked me to write a review, and I have to say I haven't actually followed the research. So you're interested. You could find the paper in JEP, HPP last year, summarizing it. It kind of reprises some of the work that Ruth Beit and I did that I thought maybe had gotten lost. So
thanks.
I would say, for career, in terms of career. So I mean, we all have to make a living. So I was fortunate career-wise that I had a few basic research hits very early on. The hindsight bias, the work I did with Sarah Lichtenstein and Paul on confidence assessment, some early work on framing, complementing what Dani and Amos did, and I was on soft money in decision research for 13 years, where we could really do whatever we wanted as long as somebody paid the bills. And they didn't always pay the bills. Occasionally we were on unemployment, along with the lumberjacks, who were the basis of the Eugene economy. But that gave a kind of freedom that one might not have in a conventional department, and enables also to create this web of basically public sector contacts, where the field the field grew really slowly in psychology, which departments because of dynamics don't turn over very quickly, and when they turn over they replace somebody who's doing, whereas the business schools saw the opportunity, have really it really helped to propel the field, but they don't tend to work on these classes of problems. So that was really fortuitous, and having done some basic science and had my first academic job as a tenured full professor, so it gave me the freedom to do these more applied things in a longer time frame. So a big pitch in that in the book I showed at the end is that I think the profession would be better off if it rewarded people who did at least some of the people who did this kind of work.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time is running up. So the formal part is over, and those who have to go can go. Baruch, thank you for this very, very interesting talk. And we will stay now for additional few minutes of informal discussion, those who
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for coming.
want can stay with us. And I'm closing the recording because it's the